Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming and getting seated and settled. It's always a tough call after. Oh, there we go. It's always a tough call after the parties and events of a Friday night to get everyone together. So I'm glad we've got people here ready to look at our new session or this morning session. I'm Riz Khan of Al Jazeera English. It's also nice to be outside America, where traditionally people hear the word Al Jazeera and then run for the doors. Although now they're watching us a bit more, I think it's a little bit better. The session's called Creating Shared Norms, the Century's Leadership Challenge, with the aim of covering 4 areas of interest: comparing 20th and 21st century norms, bridging political divides across stakeholders, defining a new social contract, and closing gender and generational gaps. And I'm going to try to make it as interactive as possible for you all once we've heard from each of our panelists briefly. And for that reason, I'll just kick off with a quick question to each of them. Let me introduce them first of all, so you know who we are, or who they are. To my immediate left here, Ms. Sharan Burrow is the Secretary General, or General Secretary, I should say, of the International Trade Union Confederation, the ITUC, who's here from Belgium. Next to her is the Prime Minister of Thailand, Abhisit Vejjajiva. We have next to the Prime Minister Herman van Rompuy, the President of the European Council of the European Union. He's joining us from Brussels. Next to him, we have Prime Minister Salam Fayyad, the Prime Minister of the Palestinian National Authority. Deputy Prime Minister and Economy Minister of Turkey, Mr. Ali Babacan there. And Carlos Ghosn is Chairman and CEO of Renault-Nissan Alliance, a member of the board also of the WEF. He's in from France. I thank you all for taking part. Just to kick off with a quick question to everyone, and perhaps Sharan Burrow, I could start with you, ma'am. I know your interest in discussing this idea of creating shared norms is the need for a new social contract. What do you mean by that?
Well, the first challenge is to recognise that there's an absence of shared norms. In the first third of the 20th century, there was much more attention to the needs of people, the needs of income security, and yet right now, in a word, you just have to say Tunisia. This was sparked by a single act of desperation in an economic context that denied employment, social protection, rights and freedoms, an economic context supported by a political context where freedoms simply weren't available. People didn't come first. Now Egypt. And if you look at this week, you've seen all of the challenges for the world on display, from climate action to unemployment, massive unemployment, the bitter crisis now of unemployment. And yet we don't see, in fact, the real solution to tackle the global imbalances, to put people first, and indeed to actually see the political courage to act on a global scale. So we want to see a new social contract. We want to see a new growth model. We want to see a share of wealth. And we would say to business, if governments have to have the political will to act, then business has to recognise that wealth must be shared.
Thank you very much. Great start, so we can actually discuss these various issues that arise. The Prime Minister of Thailand, Mr. Abhisit Vejjajiva, I know what we heard just there from Sharan Burrow is very significant, the idea of a new social contract. But of course, each region has a different challenge, and I know one of the considerations you have is meeting those different problems in different ways.
Well, I see 3 real challenges in terms of the need to create shared norms. The first is at the global level. And I think this challenge will be very, very clear this year, when in fact, while we feel that many of us have pulled through from the worst financial crisis, the fact of the matter is there is now a divergence of problems. Some regions have to address jobs problems, others inflation, others debt problems, and yet we haven't really created a conceptual framework or taken solid action to prove that we do have a shared norm. And the proof of this is the failure to reach an agreement in Doha round. The proof of this is in the failure to reach a deal on climate change, when in fact these should be common objectives for all countries. The second challenge, I think, is the political process. What we've seen last year, this year, has been levels of violence increasing, extremist groups taking more and more control and political space. This has to be stopped if we want to create a norm of a democratic, peaceful process of resolving differences. That's something that cuts across all societies, and we need to create that norm. The third challenge, I think, is that we have discovered time and again that unless the public and private sectors work in partnership, not just to fix the economy, but also to address social, environmental, and other problems, taking into account the impact of their actions, and therefore actually internalizing what we used to call economic externalities, then again, we wouldn't have a shared norm among the different sectors in society to resolve what are common objectives and common problems.
Prime Minister, thank you, sir. Herman van Rompuy, of course, Europe has proved that it can create some shared norms, can create some common values, but I know your concern is the new social compact. What specifically do you feel needs to be addressed?
Well, my introduction will be a little bit more philosophical than my colleagues, because European society has changed a lot since the last 40 or 50 years. And there's a major shift from community life, community thinking, to individualization. And of course, individualization has big advantages, a growing awareness of individual, especially women, less depending on vested authorities and so on. But when individualization turns into individualism, then something is changed in society. And one of our major problems today is that we have rising individualism in the middle of globalization. And people who are only relying on themselves can be very quickly scared when they see something strange, something different coming to them. And that gives the result of rising populism, utilizing those fears and those anxieties and those uncertainties. And that turns, even in some countries, into anti-Europeanism, but also a lack of solidarity for all what is outside their world and outside Europe. So we have a big task to promote social cohesion again in the world of globalization. And there's a lot of work to be done by politicians, of course, but it is a collective responsibility. Our work is to strengthen social cohesion as much as possible by stimulating associative life, by defending social security, so that people feel protected, even if it has to be reformed, combating fraud and corruption, encouraging families and families with children. But we have to be aware that politics have only limited possibilities. Also on the economic side, strengthening people to be more capable of getting their place in a very changing world, training, education, so as that we can limit them, limit the negative impacts of globalization and empower people. I think there's a big role also for politicians showing political courage, fighting very easy ideas of rising populism, showing respect for opponents. So there is a general society, there's a general climate that we have to change in society, so that there is much more social cohesion and community thinking than it is today. Social bonds and linkages are indispensable for that new idea that came up last years in a lot of European countries, that idea of happiness. And so my introduction was more philosophical, political, but I think it is in the heart of the problems we face today in Europe.
So thank you very much. Prime Minister Salam Fayyad, of course, you know, it is a challenging world politically and economically, and I wonder, when you look at the perspective you have on this, I know one of the considerations you think about is the need for governments to be more sensitive to change, and what is missing right now then?
As a matter of overall disposition, I believe governments have to be responsive to the desire for change on the part of those who govern. I think governments should honor that desire. I believe certainly they should not be dismissive of it as a matter of overall disposition. Of course, under that heading and disposition, there are measures that are required. People's desire for change is often, of course, if not always, expressed against the backdrop of lack of satisfaction with status quo, politically, economically, socially, culturally, what have you. Overall, I think to the extent governments find themselves in a position where they are not leading the change, they should certainly, under those conditions, should embrace it. That begins with certainly honoring the desire for change. It requires understanding where that's coming from and taking corrective measures, beginning with owning up to problems to the extent that there are problems, fully, without equivocation or hesitation, out of really wanting to do the right thing. Generally speaking, those measures fall under the heading of governance, good governance precepts, whether in a political sense, whether in an economic or administrative sense. Fundamentally, it really boils down to full acceptance of the need to be, as the President mentioned in the latter part of his remarks, respectful of the sensitivities and disposition of those who govern.
So thank you very much. I'll get back to some of the points you made very shortly. Let me bring in Deputy Prime Minister Ali Babacan of Turkey, Economy Minister too. So you're saying that it's important that there are some common values and universal values that have to be implemented. Turkey and Spain, of course, led this movement that has come under the UN umbrella, the Alliance of Civilization, and has tried to address some of these issues that we're looking at here. Let me ask you then, what is the biggest challenge in trying to implement universal values?
Well, when we look at what is going on country by country within Europe or in other parts of the world, when we look at the growing discrepancies between different cultures and tensions rising in different parts of the world, it is very important to come up with supranational umbrellas, supranational universal values, norms, and not only just mention them, but implement them, raise the awareness of them, and how to create more ownership for those values and common understanding. Within this approach, Spain and Turkey, we started an initiative called Alliance of Civilizations, and it is mostly about interfaith dialogue, intercultural dialogue. It is about empathy. It is about how to bridge the differences. We mentioned this idea, we started to voice it, and we opened a list called Friends of Alliance. And we were actually quite surprised that right now already more than 100 countries signed up to that list. We had one major conference in Madrid, a second one in Istanbul, a third one in Brazil, and many regional organizations going on right now for this. There needs an active involvement of governments, opinion leaders, NGOs. If there is no active involvement, then we are afraid that these differences could lead to even further problems. What is going on right now, especially in the close vicinity of Turkey, when we look at Middle East, when we look at Central Asia, when we look at even Europe, there are many problems. And countries are becoming more closed. The differences, the polarization is growing within each country. And an inward-looking approach is unfortunately more and more prevailing. Politicians have a lot to do with this. Opinion leaders have a lot to do with this. Sometimes it is easy for politicians just to follow the developments in the society. Just look at the public opinion polls and trying to give pleasing messages to them. However, it is right now the time to lead the opinions, to lead the changes in the societies. And then if we just follow the public opinion polls, if we just tell good things which just people want to hear about, then the rising populism, as Mr. President has already told, is going to be the unfortunate outcome for this. Turkey is a country in between continents, in between cultures, in between very different regions, and historically, for hundreds and hundreds of years, we have been, in a way, at the junction of all these quite different and complicated parts of the world. But what we are doing right now in our country and with our foreign policy is to have a more encompassing approach, to defend international law wherever we are in the world, to defend fundamental rights, freedoms wherever we are in the world, to defend democracy wherever we are in the world. Unfortunately, sometimes we observe some countries, even developed countries, developed democracies, to embrace these values at their homeland, but then have a different standards, a different approach to other countries in different parts of the world. So in order to have more ownership and in order to have a more inclusive approach for different segments of the society, for different cultures, for different countries and nations, we should really have a much larger encompassing umbrella to find the commonalities, to emphasize commonalities rather than make politics on differences.
So thank you very much. Carlos Ghosn, Renault-Nissan, of course, you have interesting challenges there. It's almost like a microcosm of the world in the sense that you have 350,000 employees representing about 120 nationalities. And I know that in this sort of increasingly globalized world, you feel that diversity is a fundamental lever we have that we could use.
Well, you know, it's very common now to talk about the new normal. And diversity used to be something relatively good to have, optional, a little bit modern, futuristic. Now it's the main lever of management. And let me give you a few examples so we can speak very concretely about it. I mean, a few years ago, what you would see in corporation is probably male-dominated corporations with a specific age in charge of the company, and this age can be very different. For example, in Japan, if you're 60 years old, you're considered probably as immature. I mean, you can't take a top job if you didn't cross 60 years old. In France, when you're 60, you're already retired or pre-retired. So you had a very specific age for top management. The third element I would like to mention is, again, not a long time ago, the companies based in Japan or France or the United States used to have particularly citizen of their own country managing the group. That means the non-home citizen were very rare at the top level of large corporation. All of this today we know is gone. And we are trying to develop gender gap, eliminate gender gap, generational gap, and also try to have as much as possible non-citizens coming to large corporation in order to understand and embrace diversity. But the main element, not only we need it, but at the same time that the best practices in each one of them, you need to share them. Because it is exactly the same way how you empower women in a large corporation. The best practices are exactly the same as how do you reduce the generational gap, or how do you bring more foreigner into your company, no matter where your company is being based. It's exactly the same practice, in terms of succession planning, in terms of quota, in terms of coaching, etc. So when we talk about shared norms, yes, we are going to have to share a lot, the best practices. We are facing a lot of norms, and we don't have too much time.
So thank you very much, and thank you all for keeping those introductory comments brief so we can actually involve our participants too. And if anyone has a question, please do put your arm up very clearly, and I will try to get to the microphone to you in the order in which you hands went up. Did we see one go up anywhere? It's kind of trying to see how good. We have a little more light. So we have the microphone standing by. Please do put your hands up and give us your thoughts on this topic and on some of the comments made by our participants. While I wait for the hands to go up, Sharan Burrow, let me expand a bit on what you said on the issue of the need for a new social contract. And you said Tunisia is an example and we should be watching this. Now, do you feel that the change that's being driven by what we see in a place such as Tunisia and now, of course, in Egypt as well, has a broader implication? Or is it, because everyone said, certain governments in certain countries should beware. But is there a broader implication? Is it a lesson for countries which don't have this potential political turmoil, but as you suggest, maybe some social considerations to address?
Look, I think President Van Rompuy was right. This isn't an issue just for Northern Africa, although, of course, let me say that we're all watching that with great anxiety because of the threat to lives now, not just livelihoods. But there has been a shift from us to me. And there's an even bigger shift in terms of the divorce from the political representatives who were elected by people to actually make societies better for people, who are in fact fearful. I mean, there is a deficit, I'm sorry to say, of political will. Good people, all of these politicians here, good people, well-intentioned, but collectively fearful of upsetting the market, fearful of now standing up in Europe to the bond markets, fearful of putting in place financial sector regulation, although 2 years ago that was the biggest thing that governments promised to do, fearful of investing in jobs and social protection, irrespective of the fact that if you go back to the 1930s, the developed world got rich off the back of actually investing in people, in social protection, in jobs, and these countries weren't wealthy then. They'd just come out of the Great Depression. So we do see a lack of political will, a lack of shared norms, and I'm really pleased to hear the CEO of Renault-Nissan introduce issues like the gender gap, like the intergenerational gap. We are in danger of losing a generation of people and ignoring the capacity of women to solve the problems of the world because we haven't got the respect for the norms that we do share. And I'd simply say to you that we have the tools. We actually have the tools. There's a human rights declaration. There are labour laws. And yet you hear labour laws called protectionism. But how do you distribute wealth if you don't have social protection, you don't have a minimum wage, you don't have collective bargaining rights, you don't invest in jobs and skills? I mean, these are the things that actually keep the economy going. And yet business, equally with politicians, are holding us captive to a market-driven world rather than a world that's about people, that's facilitated by a healthy market.
I'm going to pick up on something you said in just a moment. Let me get the first question in from our participants. Thank you for your patience. Tell us who you are and where you're from as well.
Catherine Bennell from the International Herald Tribune. I have a question for Carlos Ghosn. Too often in Davos, I have a feeling that there's, we talk about a lack of willingness, a lack of courage. It comes to different guises. Ultimately, I think it's a lack of leadership. And I do have to say, I deal with a lot of politicians. Sometimes I feel that there's a lack of charisma and a lack of leadership among politicians. Maybe they face constraints, but I do wish they would inspire us a little more. So I wonder, Carlos Ghosn, whether you, as a business leader, who has inspired a lot of people, certainly in your company, can give some lessons or some tips to politicians to become a little bit more charismatic and inspiring.
Well, I'm in trouble. No, I'm in trouble. Frankly, I think many, when we're talking about diversity, if we take this point, because I think this is going to play a big role coming on. I mean, you have to have conviction. It's not a question of, rationale. It's, you have to do this because you come to this conclusion. You have to have conviction. People have to feel that behind the rationality, there is a belief, there is an engagement, there is an involvement. I think if, what you call whatever charisma or motivation is connected to the fact that people feel that behind the rationality there is passion and there is belief and there is engagement. And every time, no matter who is the person, is a political figure or it's a business leader, whenever people listen to what you say and that they can see that behind what you're saying, there is engagement, there is involvement, there is conviction, they're going to listen to you. Even if they don't agree with what you say, they have a tendency to listen and eventually try to understand what is the issue. So in my opinion, my own experience is, no matter where you are, just make sure if you want to go through a certain challenge, just make sure you're convinced of it. Because if you're not, people are going to notice it. And if they notice you're not convinced, they're not going to listen.
Thank you, sir. Now, something that Sharan Burrow said was interesting. You talked about the need for, the challenges, economic challenges that often face people in society at the lower end, certainly to build a stable society. These economic challenges need to be addressed. So we're going to do something a little unusual here. We've got a video message here to all of us from a gentleman who was hoping to attend in person. You'll know who it is in a second, and very well-known person, was unable to attend, but he kindly sent us his thoughts on this topic of creating shared norms, and I wanted to make sure he could share them with you. He is, of course, the winner of the 2006 Nobel Peace Prize and founder of the immensely successful microcredit institution, the Grameen Bank, Dr. Muhammad Yunus. This is what he sent us as a message.
Sorry that I couldn't be with you this time in Davos. Circumstances in Bangladesh do not allow me to come to Davos this time, but I'm very happy that I could be with you and participating on this topic, shared norms, creating shared norms. And it's a very important goal to achieve that. But in order to achieve that, we need some basic consensus on objectives. What kind of life we want to have, what kind of role we play on this planet, what we see the future of the world, what kind of world we want to build. So once we have general consensus of these ideas about our life, about the planet, then we can talk about our shared responsibilities to achieve that. Without that responsibility, shared responsibility, it would be difficult to establish the shared norms. And today, we have difficulties in creating those shared norms because of a basic flaw in the conceptual framework of the economic world that we have, particularly the economic world based on capitalist framework. That is too limiting factor. In the capitalist framework that we have right now, we are all pursuing our individual goals of maximizing profit. So that's a very self-centered or individual-centered, person-centered kind of world that we look forward to. That shared dreams have to be achievable, and social business allows us to achieve that. So I'm very happy that in Davos I see great attention to the social business, and this year in Davos I hope social business will go to a greater level of attention, and there will be initiatives all around the world so that we can create a better world, a world that we can address to solve problems for all of us, and then shared norms will emerge from these shared objectives. Thank you. Thank you for listening to me.
And our thanks, of course, to Dr. Muhammad Yunus for sending us that message and sharing his thoughts. It leads me on to ask Prime Minister Abhisit Vejjajiva on something that you raised here. You talked about, well, let me just refer to what Dr. Yunus said. He talked about the need for basic consensus before we can have shared norms, and he said we have shared responsibilities. And you mentioned the lack of shared norms that we have, giving an example such as the lack of agreement on environmental issues, the failure. What is the reason for that? Why do we not have these basic consensus issues addressed? Is it the capitalistic framework that Dr. Yunus referred to?
No, frankly speaking, I think despite what global leaders say, they are still very much dictated by domestic politics. They are still very much dictated by their own national agenda and conditions. And many of my colleagues have already shared the pressure these days that leaders have to respond to the issues of the day, to the internal controversies that happen within their own borders. And always it is more convenient, it is easier to take the convenient way, the easy way out. So rather than doing the best for the common good, you just address the short-term issues. I think that's what we need to really address. And when I mentioned the failure to reach agreement with the trade round, with the climate change talks, it's a clear reflection that while we talk about globalization, common goals, we still cannot move beyond our own national interests and are still confined by the environment within which we work politically.
And of course, Herman van Rompuy, you've talked about your concerns of this climate of rising individualism that we are encountering. Do you think that plays into this idea of not having the shared norms, not having the basic consensus?
Yeah, but let's be not too pessimistic neither, because we are fully aware of our problems inside our societies. I will just give a brief comment on the lady who put that question just a few minutes ago. But that's clear that we have all problems inside our borders. But I saw, certainly in the beginning of the financial crisis, also that effort to take things, put it in another way, I saw that effort for a global governance, and that was the G20. The G20 went well in the beginning of the crisis, and don't forget that this was the biggest crisis in 70 years, a financial crisis. and that after 1 year, in some countries not even 1 year, we get out of the crisis, in some way out of the recession, and that we had more positive economic growth all over the world. The crisis of the 30s never stopped. It ended in the war. So let us not be over pessimistic neither. Because we know that we have big challenges, and new problems, climate change and globalization, interconnectedness, and so the problem of one country can become the problem of a lot of countries. In Europe, we started with a problem in one country, 10 million inhabitants. It became the problem of 350 million, and at the end it was a world problem. So that is completely new. And we need, of course, global governance, but it is a process step by step. We will not reach it, we will not get it overnight. So I'm a little bit more optimistic than the thoughts I hear not here because we haven't discussed it already, but in a general climate we are very pessimistic over what's going on in the world. But we never faced problems on that scale. And I think we are at the beginning of a process of global governance and don't expect too much. But that is one of the big problems today. There is a lot of impatience, and we all see the problems, but we are raising expectations, and then there's a need to deliver immediately. You can't do it. But direction is important, that if we are working in the right direction. Speed is less important. But of course, we haven't to raise too much the expectations so that we stay credible and that we get trust from the people. I see a lot of political courage in many countries to face their problems. I see a lot of political courage, certainly in Europe, but also outside Europe. But we need to have a new kind of political leadership. Not by raising expectations, being over-charismatic, but step by step going in the right direction. And I hope that we can do it on a global scale. But this is a new approach, but I'm fully aware of the problems, I'm fully aware of all what is lacking these days, but still the G20 was for me a sign of hope. But we have to continue that process. It is not only a meeting each year, it is a process for every day.
Sharan Burrow, you had a comment, yeah.
Absolutely. The crisis for working people is not over. And in fact, they were conned by the G20. We went out and supported the G20 in coordinated stimulus measures because we thought that the country leaders believed in jobs. They told us in London and Pittsburgh absolutely quality jobs would be at the heart of the recovery. The same unorthodox approach to saving the financial sector would be there for jobs. Our money, taxpayers' money, propped up the financial system, but unemployment, 210 million, the biggest challenge the world's faced, 45 million young people every year entering the labour market, no jobs, and indeed women, millions of women, not on the statisticians' books, either being forced to or choosing to want to participate in the labour market, not there. And then in Europe, I'm sorry, but you go from coordinated social Europe to fragmented austerity, irrespective of the consequences and without a plan for growth. We believe in fiscal consolidation, but over time, leveraged off growth. And I must say the European Commission, their conditionality now against the rights of working people is worse than the IMF. In fact, we're working with the IMF. Think about that shift in approach. A Labor leader saying the IMF is a better deal today for working people, potentially around jobs, than the European Commission that's just told Romania to take away collective bargaining rights, to lower the minimum wage, to cut workers' pay in the public sector by 25%. Now, hopefully we'll get through that with dialogue. But we say to politicians, you can't have said to us, spend, 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 not raised an issue about debt before the crisis, watch the financial sector, absolutely, bonuses are back, profits are back, but not make one contribution. No financial transactions tax. How do the people of Africa feel? All of the promises, and yet the corporate world, the government will not raise a fraction of a dollar, either on bunker fuels or on a financial transactions tax to look after the people. So, yeah, we're pretty angry.
I'm going to see if any more hands go up, and while I wait, please, Prime Minister.
Can I respond to some of the issues that has been raised? And it comes back to the basic point I was making, that we have to move beyond the old paradigm of how these problems are solved. I'll give you an example. In Thailand, when we were faced with the economic crisis, and we said that the number one priority was to make sure that the jobs are still there. We didn't do it through the typical stimulus package of government investment in infrastructure. We knew that was going to take time. What we did was to call around the private sector and agreed on what needed to be done in terms of incentives to be provided so that they would retain and retrain their people. I think we need to look at these kinds of new models of resolving problems. Even the issue of increasing security for our workers, we have so many in the informal sector. I mean, for so long, the various governments in Thailand have tried to incorporate people in the informal sector into social security and failed, basically because they never listened to the communities, to the people themselves. Now we've got a solution because we listened to them, what needed to be done to change the regulations, to get them in, and sometimes you need the people themselves to implement and enforce among themselves the discipline that is needed to create a social security system. So I'm saying that that there are problems that need new ways of thinking and new ways of resolving, and we need to move beyond the old models.
Now, I know both Mr. Fayyad and Mr. Babacan have a comment. Mr. Fayyad first, sir.
Yes, thank you. First of all, capitalism maybe it can be blamed for many things, but I do not believe it by itself can be blamed for lack of ability to forge consensus on shared norms. I think it's really more competition and rivalry, more domestic considerations, particularly in advanced countries that take over. And I think it's probably more reflective of the fact that, notwithstanding the fact that globalization proceeded very fast, progress toward putting together an adequate framework for global governance did not match that. So yes, I agree that it's important first to ensure that we are on the right track. But I disagree that speed is not important. I think it's really important to really move as fast as possible in order to create that convergence. Because unless that happens, convergence on shared norms, when it happens, is not going to manifest itself or reflect itself in changes on the ground, particularly on those countries which have a lot of distance to cover, to catch up, to bridge that gap. So speed is absolutely essential, and I think it's very important to fast develop that framework of global governance.
Now, just a thought here, Prime Minister. You're asking for this speed at a time when people are tightening their belts, and presumably this need to embrace change that you referred to in the opening comments is being limited by the fact that the austerity measures needed are the priority.
Let me give you an example. The impact of those austerity measures, or the scope of the austerity measures that may be required to deal with an economic shock, a price shock of sorts, can be mitigated, or certainly it doesn't have, the scope doesn't have to be as broad as it would otherwise needs to be, if in fact advanced economies around the world were to deal with fundamental issue of protectionism, lack of adequate access to their own markets, particularly in agriculture, where developing countries, the South generally, has decided comparative advantage. I think it's much better for the welfare of consumers everywhere in advanced economies and LDCs as well, for there to be an opening up of markets, for certain.
Before I get to another question from our participants, Mr. Babacan, you had one as well.
Well, talking about shared norms, the global governance is also another important subject here. After the Second World War, we have institutions, Bretton Woods institutions. We have United Nations Security Council especially, which is an important setup there. When we came up with G20 summits, unfortunately it was only after the crisis that G20 meetings were held at leaders level, then we came up with really good ideas. And the decisions of G20 had a wide base, and hence it was legitimate in the eyes of the people. And then we made important decisions. For example, the governance of IMF changed. There were reserved seats for 5 countries, And now at the board, it will be an all-elected board. Now we have a United Nations Security Council where we have again reserved seats for 5 countries. And when the setup of the Security Council is like this, the decisions taken and the legitimacy of the decisions taken are always under question. Maybe another important element here, which I want to just open parentheses and touch on, is Turkey's process into the European Union. It was a very important project because it was about also peace of cultures in a way. It's about an interaction of cultures, and we always thought European Union is a big peace project, again, started after the Second World War. Many countries joined around common values and norms, having more and more countries involved. But then the enlargement process of the European Union literally stalled. The open door policy is no longer there. And then we are seeing European Union more and more of a closed entity, more inward-looking entity. And one of the big themes about why Turkey cannot become a member of the European Union is that it is a Christian club. This is, in our view, very, very dangerous. If we are talking about universal values, those values should be encompassing all ethnicities, religions, religious sects, and it should be about commonalities, not about differences. So this is an important process because everybody is following very, very closely whether the European Union is going to say, okay, this is the wall and we don't want anyone else, or are the doors going to be open for any country fulfilling the norms, fulfilling the criteria. And this is influencing a lot in our region because everybody is looking at what is going on and what kind of a Europe, what kind of a European Union we are going to be seeing in the future is going to be of immense importance in terms of what kind of messages it sends throughout the region.
Minister, a quick thought. Isn't there a feeling nowadays that the world is starting to look a lot more east than west?
Well, I think there is still a long way. What's happening right now is East is gaining more power in terms of economy. But this is not yet translating into fundamental rights, freedoms, rule of law. It's still not there. But hopefully, by having more open societies, by having access to information, by having more shared ideas through social networks, this may be a later phase in the process. Unfortunately, there's going to be a lag between what's going on.
Thank you, sir. Sir, thank you for your patience. Let's get your question. Tell us who you are and where you're from, and then we'll come to our second guest after that.
So thank you very much. My name's Rob Steele. I'm the Secretary General of the International Organization for Standardization, or ISO. My organization has about 18,500 norms, if I could put it that way. It seems to me that there's 2 levels we can be talking about here. One is the very high level political, international economic view. The other is a more pragmatic one, where people are actually wanting to have some guidance. People are actually wanting to make some progress. People are wanting to know pragmatically how they can actually make a difference. I'll give you 3 examples. My organization this year will publish standards on water footprinting, energy efficiency, and we have published a standard on social responsibility. Why? Because basically business, consumers, and NGOs and governments are actually looking for some norms, but not norms at a high level, norms on how you can actually do stuff. I wonder if the panel could comment about how you actually can make progress and tangible progress, because I think there's a huge amount of frustration out there where people are talking endlessly and going round in circles and talking about different speeds, and actually nothing is really pragmatically happening.
Thank you, sir. Sharan Burrow, this is an interesting comment, and I wonder where the 2 levels you're talking about, the high level and the grassroots level, are diverging. What voice does that grassroots level have?
Well, they are diverging, but they have to actually come back together. You do have to empower people, and if you go to Egypt, for example, it was just a few months ago, a mere month or so after I took up this new role, that I spoke to the Labour Minister from Egypt, and I encouraged her to go back and seriously think about freedom of association, because we knew the frustration that was there, to put proper laws about collective bargaining in place, to look at social protection and minimum wages, to give people some hope that they'd have security and opportunity. Now, needless to say, she didn't listen, and we know that right now I've got people there talking to our independent unions who are joining with the people to say we want a better deal. The same happened in Tunisia, of course, and so on. But, you know, if you go back to Copenhagen, it broke people's hearts because, in fact, the people did expect their leaders to act on climate. They were absolutely there with them, heart and soul. And yet the leaders of the world couldn't come to some basic agreement under a UN framework. Those institutions that we heard the Deputy Prime Minister talk about were really important in the last century. They were, however, rendered more and more impotent towards the end of the century, and unless we rebuild global institutions, global governance, with the application of community values and norms, then we are not going to actually see the challenges that we face today dealt with in any significant way, and the discord will grow. There's no doubt. You know, we believe in social dialogue. My mission is to fix problems, to drive advocacy for working people, but to sit at the table with business and fix problems. And yet we see all manner of discord right now between even European companies who have a good social record in their own country, but actually deny fundamental rights and freedoms in the countries of others. And we heard that touched on. So we say to business, you've got to work with us and the people. The people have to have confidence in their governments, and we've got to actually find that global governance that meets the test of what people are asking for.
Thank you. Carlos Ghosn, this is an interesting point. And is there a pressure on big business and the private sector to pick up where the governments are failing to deliver? This lack of deliverance perhaps is now pressure on you guys.
Look, let me answer from another point of view, because as you said, you know, let's go down from the 50,000 feet vision and go to the ground. There is a little bit expectation that, you know, whenever a new product comes and new service comes, that we don't have different norms and different standards, because consumers today, you know, are looking, they are surfing, and they don't understand why this diversity and what is the benefit of this diversity. So there is a big opportunity today because of the renewal. I mean, the products becoming obsolete very quickly, the technologies are really moving up. I don't think we can fix the past. I think it's going to take too much time, too much energy to fix the past. But what we can do is fix what's coming. Let me give you a specific example. You know very well that in terms of cars, there are new technology coming. Let me take one example, electric cars. Electric cars are coming. There are new batteries. There are new ways. And this is very important for consumer. So what we're trying to do as an industry, and it's tough because there are a lot of competitive issues, is to try, let's make sure that we have one plug. One plug. Okay? Because if consumers start to say, okay, if I move from one country to the other, I have a different plug, I have a different device, it's a problem. For the suppliers, it's a problem. For the legislature, it's a problem. For the electricity company, it's a problem. So just making sure that you have one plug for this technology is very simple, you know, requires some effort of standardization. We're going to have to do more of it by trying to be extremely pragmatic and looking at it not only from a competitive point of view or from a national point of view or from a regional point of view, but from a consumer or a citizen point of view.
I think what you say is relevant. I'm sure everyone in this room has been carrying travel adapters for their a quick thought, Mr. Babacan.
Just a very, very short additional comment. Now, what we probably need is more of a good discussion environment among leaders about what is needed to be done. And G20 so far discussed only economic issues, nothing else. We believe that G20 should also start discussing political issues, security issues, because it's a good representative group, and you have 20 leaders around the table which can have a healthy discussion. And we don't have a substitute for that in any setting. G7, G8, okay, but it is not representative.
United Nations?
United Nations is too wide, and it is very difficult to discuss things or a healthy discussion with more than 190 leaders around one table. It is going to be just delivered speeches of 2 minutes. So we need a healthy discussion environment, but a healthy discussion among leaders of countries which could be representative of the world in a way. So this is something which we want to be more upbeat
Let me just we have a guest waiting patiently with a question. Tell us who you are as well, sir.
My name is Denis Simoneau. I work for GDF Suez, energy and environment company, present in more than 70 countries, in Thailand, in Belgium, in Turkey. We are facing a quite interesting situation in Tunisia and Egypt, and Mrs. Burrow just spoke about it. My question would be to the panel. I would be very interested in your comments on the current situation and the expectations, especially maybe Mr. Fayyad, Mr. Babacan, but all members of the panel would be interesting to hear. Thank you.
Right. And in trying to keep it with the theme of this session of creating new norms, shared norms, Prime Minister Fayyad, perhaps your thoughts on that. What's happening now in Tunisia and the way it's escalated elsewhere might perhaps affect, well, I guess you look at it business perspective and the issue of stability and investment in the region.
Thank you. First of all, I cannot... let's say that I'm intrigued by the comment made by Mr. Ghosn on the one plug issue in and I wish the cellular phone industry would follow that and begin to make just one plug for adapters and all. Also, a quick comment on what my colleague from Turkey said about the need for other than the UN for fear that the UN is too diffused. It may be the case that there are too many too small countries around the world, and we Palestinians are trying to add to that another small country. But I'm a firm believer in the need for the United Nations, and to have that supplanted by other fora where the voice of those small countries is somehow subsumed by countries of regional standing that they think is important enough to project. I do not believe that from longer term point of view that's necessarily a contributor to stability and healthy international relations. This is a call for looking again at what the United Nations was established for and making it work better rather than coming up with alternatives to this. On the issue of change in the region, how it might affect business, the business environment, no question. When you go through a period of the kind that our region is going through, I liken it, and we had this light conversation right before the session here, to a turbulence that a plane goes through. It is not likely that in this particular case the plane would go through the turbulence and emerge out of it in the same way it got into it. There's no question that there are changes that need to take place. While that is happening, obviously that creates a period of uncertainty, a bit of tension. Nevertheless, I believe if this process of change is managed well, and that begins again by those in government not being dismissive of the desire for change, given the high degree of dissatisfaction with status quo, I think if the process is managed with that in mind, I believe the environment would then give way to a more stable, in a sustainable sense, environment would be good for business. It's important, of course, as part of the effort going forward, to think in terms of adequate structures of governance in each and every one of those countries, in a way that's responsive to the needs of those who are governed, respectful, again, of their rights as citizens in those countries. That creates for, on a more lasting basis, of course, for a more stable and sustainable business environment.
Right, thank you, sir. There, unfortunately, we're out of time. It's interesting when you talked about the UN. It made me remember a joke I'd been told when I was 11 years old. They said, do you know what happened when the maid serving Christmas dinner at the United Nations stumbled and fell? It caused the downfall of Turkey, the overflow of Greece, the destruction of China, and the starvation of Hungary. Thank you very much for your participation. A round of applause for our panelists, please.
Thank you.
Sorry we have no more time for this, but thank you for your participation. Thanks.